Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today our guest is Michael D'Alessandro, who came to Port Townsend about a year ago from Portland, Oregon. He's currently serving as the executive director of the Northwind Arts Center. He established and continues to run Bedouin Books, and we'll be talking about that more in the program to come. In Portland, he served as Community Resource Coordinator and Development Assistant for the Independent Publishing Resource Center, a 15-year nonprofit arts organization specializing in providing resources for writers, publishers, artists, and printers. He also founded the press, as I spoke about, and they publish literature and poetry. It began in 2003. He's also an architect and earned his living as an architect for 12 years before earning his MFA in creative writing from the Naropa University. Michael has worked several years at Frolic Gallery in Portland, where he was responsible for a range of visitor and client interactions, administrative tasks, and art handling. Michael has also taught creative writing and publishing, letterpress printing, and bookbinding at Marylhurst University and the IPRC. Locally now, he teaches seminars in poetry at the Writers' Workshop. He has a strong belief in community building as well as in writing, and today we're going to talk about his writing and the way his other endeavors all inform that writing, or vice versa, the way the writing he writes and publishes informs his other endeavors and community building. So I want to welcome you to the show, Michael.
Thank you. It's nice, great to be here.
Thank you, and it's nice to learn more about you as a relatively new resident of Port Townsend. There are so many places we could start today, but I think one very interesting one would be to start with your own private publishing endeavor and when it started, 2003, I believe I just read, and what brought you to do that and how it's developed.
Yes, back in 2003, I was thinking about going back to school. I was floundering in my architecture career and looking for something to really recharge my batteries, and decided that I liked making things and started designing and binding and building little books, chapbooks, and then started pamphleting them around town in San Francisco, where I was living at the time, and tried to get them in the hands of poets like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and other people that were big on the scene there in North Beach, and got them into City Lights on their consignment rack, and have had a long relationship with them for the last 12 years. So then I went back to get my MFA. The book thing kind of was on hold while I was developing my own writing, and immediately upon graduating, I started publishing other writers that I was coming into contact with through my program, and it started full speed from there.
Let me ask you a question. You were between architecture and your next endeavor when you started the publishing company.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the meaning of the name, Bedouin Books, Bedouin, has something to do with, I think, transitions and movement. Do you want to explain how you came up with the title of your press?
Yeah. Many years ago, I was taking a trip to the Middle East to do some work with an archaeology project as a project architect for the archaeology dig, and a friend of mine and I traveled through the deserts of Jordan and spent a lot of time with Bedouin. And I really loved their way of life, not only picking up and moving around, but also the way they told stories. They didn't have books necessarily, so there's a little bit of an odd part there with the name, but they relied heavily on the oral tradition and still do, and they pick up their stories with them and take them wherever they go. So that kind of gave me a little bit of inspiration for the title. And
now your press picks up and goes wherever you go.
Yeah.
San Francisco, Portland, Port Townsend.
Right, and even Hawaii for a little while.
So when you started the publishing and you were trying to get your books to the attention of Ferlinghetti, how did you have your first writers find you, or you find them for publishing their work?
A lot of submissions I receive are directly through my website. A lot of people that I've published, I've solicited them for work as well.
Through the website for Bedouin Books?
Yes, through my Bedouin Books website.
That website is
bedouinbooks.com.
Well, let's spell Bedouin.
B as in boy, E, D as in David, O-U-I-N, and then books.
Thank you. Sure. I know I've spelled it wrong the first time I wrote it down.
Yeah.
So they found you because people, especially poets, are eager to publish, and chapbooks are often an entry in, right?
Yeah, chapbooks are an entry, and the size of the books I produce are rather small, quarter, 8.5 by 11 page size. I hand bind the books and do all the design work, and sort of an architect of books is what I see myself as.
I can see that. Michael was kind enough to bring a sampling of the books here, and they are quite beautiful and well designed.
Yeah, it's hard to present that on a radio program, but
yeah. So if they went to your website, they would see photos of the books.
Yeah, they'd see the cover designs, and you can order directly from there and then have the book in hand. I try to get them into stores here locally. Since I've only moved here a year ago, I'm looking into getting them into Seattle Market and some bookstores here in town.
Well, here's a little tip. I have friends who have been successful selling books at the farmers market here in town. So something I think publishers and writers ought to be thinking about. She did quite well. So now that it's been a year since you started this and you have a line of books, do they all stay in print?
Yeah, that's one of the themes or the missions of my press is to keep the books in print. And what that means is so many presses today, I think, especially with the changes in publishing, will put out the flavor of the month or mid-list. People will get pushed off the cliff, if you will, the publishing cliff, and never be printed again and lose their momentum. And the idea of literature for our purposes today, I think, is kind of getting lost in this mill of publishing and trying to just scrape your way to the top and get press for your book. So I've wanted to commit the work that I do as a publisher to the overall cadre of literature and trying to keep things in print for that purpose.
Have you seen some of the writers that you've published go on to publish longer books, other presses? Do they keep in touch?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, that's the thing. Imagining keeping a book in print means that I'm keeping in touch with these authors as much as I can. Many of the authors I publish, it's their first book. They go on and continue to submit writing to journals and get other books published through other publishers. And I've been around now 12 years, and I'm noticing that I might publish a second book by these authors. So there's this long relationship that can come out of this kind of attention to keeping a book in print.
And also, sometimes I know something that appeared in an early book will be reappearing in another book, or in an anthology. So I just wanted to ask you if any of you writers have written to you for permission to use something that came from their first book in some other publication.
There has been a couple of instances of that, and my contract with these writers it's very simple. And I like to give the rights to the authors themselves, and there's very little rights that are being retained by myself, the publisher.
That's a great gift to the writer.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to personally thank you for doing that for writers. It's very hard to get your work out there, and it's very hard when publishers are eager to keep rights. For instance, I published in a Seattle publication, a literary magazine or tabloid sort of style, a magazine a long time ago, and didn't realize that I had signed my rights to that poem could not appear anywhere else without permission of the publisher, which is pretty unusual, really, for one poem. Usually the second publisher just wants either they accept previously published or they don't. It's that clear. And in this case, it was because the publisher wanted someday to do an anthology and wanted to have the rights to that. So that was a kind of a learning curve for me, to learn that I had to read my contracts. I couldn't just assume, hey, my poem's going out there and someday it'll go somewhere else. But whole books are usually quite a bit different, so I think it's really kind of you to be nurturing these writers. It means so much to a writer to have an editor like their work and want to see it in a book. And I think the first people who publish our work are forever in our hearts in a special place. And that brings me to the question of, when you were leaving architecture, had your experience in Jordan in the desert, and then came home to design books and publish them and put up a website and people found you. Where in this did you decide you wanted to write? Because you later went on to get your MFA.
I was writing the whole time I was doing that, putting the press together. And I found that what would be really good for me to do is put out one of my books with my press, in the spirit of what City Lights did and what Ferlinghetti did with the Pocket Poet series, putting out the first one being his book, and then, now they're on 70 or more at this point. So I took that as my inspiration, and I've been writing since, but less so now because I think the publishing sort of took a front seat, and I started doing a lot more with putting out 3 or 4 books a year, especially recently, and my writing got pushed a little bit to the background. But in the last 2 years, I've been picking up my writing practice a lot more, and I was published a year ago, or last April, in an online journal, a print journal as well. I'm currently working on some translations of the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, the French poet.
All right. Well, I think that when you're writing, it is said everything is writing. So learning about publishing, putting yourself out there, forming a group of people whose work you admire, sharing it with the world, and then getting more invested in your own writing is really very interesting. And I think also perhaps a bit unusual that you have the energy and the talent to be an organizer, a community network builder, as well as the solitary writer. So before we talk about the translations, which is what you're currently doing, perhaps we have a moment for you to read something from your work before. And I know that before we began our taping here, you told me that you're writing or did write prose poetry. So maybe before you read a couple of those, you could tell us about the place of prose poetry in your writing life.
Well, it's been interesting because I entered writing many years ago with the journal, which is a lot of writers do. They just keep a journal, and a lot of times what came out of the journal was prose, and then poetry would come from that as well. And I really latched onto poetry early on in my writing life, then started moving toward essays and more prose pieces and sort of dense reviews and criticisms and things like that. And that helped me in my MFA to work on critical and rigorous writing as well. So then prose poetry just sort of mashed all this together, and I was starting to develop series of poems that just took a real bent of kind of block text, and I also visualize a lot of the writing.
Like it.
And started developing a voice. So I've been working on a series that was published last year in Burning Words Literary Journal, and I can read a couple from that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
So these are 2 pieces. One's called She Handles Extraordinary Impasses. With the skill of the faith healer, she embraces what I manufacture for myself and relates to that fabrication, which is only a contrivance of my personality. In this case, her faith in the authenticity of my personality fractures as I retract what we manufacture together in order to preserve something I can't put my finger on. And now she is castigated for not breaking through to an underpinning in that fabrication, not shattering the mirror she didn't know she needed to shatter, but then she didn't want to yet. And this one is She Bakes Flourless Cakes. There are bags of pulverized everything on the shelves which she can use to make a cake. We wander opposite ends of the supermarket, I in the dim-lit bottle section, seeming to subsist on cheap red wine, while she in the vegetables selecting mounds of wet leafy greens. We will spend too much anyway, and I will make a fuss before the magic happens. She never makes a fuss until the magic is spent. Her fortitude is in the suspense. Her resolve lies somewhere between magic and her imagination.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM Port Townsend. If you just joined In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life, host Sheila Bender's guest is Michael D'Alessandro, Port Townsend poet and publisher.
I know that you have been teaching locally for the Writers' Workshop, teaching a poetry group, and I wonder if any of those people are writing prose poems, and if the question comes up, what makes a prose poem a poem?
Oh, that is a great question. And some of my participants in the class are actually writing prose poems, and I think it really sort of depends on whether there are lines that are broken. A block of prose text is the way we've structured it in paragraphs and, margins and books that we read and documents that we write. And really, it's kind of a good combination of the visual and the visual aesthetic, and then the text itself. And traditional poetry is just line broken after line after line, and into verse and stanzas and so forth. And I think a prose poem traditionally has been looked at as something that I don't know if it's completely defined by many people.
Well, I guess one thing to consider is we couldn't just go to a prose book or short story and lift out a paragraph and say, okay, here's my prose poem, give it a title and say it's a prose poem. I mean, there might be passages that would work, but I think on the whole, something inside that block is different. And do you have any words for what that is?
Well, I think it's an economy of language in some cases. It's a pared down way, and in a lot of ways what poetry, the practice of poetry achieves in that sense, that it's economized. I think it's a great tool for prose and fiction and nonfiction writers to kind of use, think about writing in sort of that poetic form, and then have that inform some of the texts that fiction and nonfiction writers put together in order to just take out a lot of the fluff and extra stuff that ends up in some more technical writing.
I'm kind of thinking about an exercise I learned that I find very helpful, which is, this is for lyric poetry where you are doing the line breaks. If you decide that there's some pattern you can go for where there's a certain number of lines per stanza, 2 or 3, not too many, and have to make what you wrote, your draft, conform to that, you automatically start to see what you're calling the fluff, the extra words, the repeats, the phrases that diminish the power of the images. And I wonder how that works in a prose poem, how you look at it and go, okay, since I've been trained to look at the line break issue as a pattern that I can count on to help me with a poem, I wonder how a person might approach that in prose poetry without that tool. Do you have a way that you keep your language economical?
Yeah, sometimes when I'm writing these particular pieces, there's only maybe 4 or 5 sentences and a few phrases, but I'll notice that when I go back to edit them, which I typically do after I've written 4 or 5, that I will see a lot of words in there that don't need to be there, and ways to phrase sentences that can be more balanced and trimmer. And that goes back to that economy, just trying to get a point across in the most economic way, but the most visual and stimulating and best sounding way as well.
Evocative. Yeah. So you use the sentence. So what you're zeroing in on after you've written it is the sentence as a unit. See what you've done there.
And then the flow of one to another. I think it's important, especially they are the lines. They're done unbroken on the page or in the visual sense, but they are the lines that you are speaking with full stops at the end. One
other thing that I think about when I break lines, so we'll talk about how this works at prose poems, is something I learned from the poet David Wagner a long time ago, and it was actually surprising to me when I first learned it, although it's not that surprising now. And he said, if you want to gain momentum in a poem, you need long lines and short lines. And most of us distinguish poems by short lines. We think a poem is more likely to be short lines. Actually decreases the momentum, he said, because you're always asking the reader, to stop. And so it slows your poem down. If you want things to go faster and build up this momentum, you need longer lines. Well, the prose poem is kind of perhaps the longest of that, because your long lines mesh into one paragraph, or I think we call it a paragraph in prose poetry. Maybe it's still a stanza. Yeah. Do you have a sense of that, about how momentum works inside a prose poem?
Yeah, I think the pauses come at the end of the sentences with the full stops, and maybe a slight pause on a comma, but I personally don't like the comma in the prose poems, especially in this series that I'm working on, that the only punctuation is that period. I think that allows there to be pause, but it does speed up the reading of it and the hearing of it as well. And
so that's why you don't like the commas, because it's a slowed down mechanism?
Yeah, I think it might add a pause where there may not need to be one. And so that helps you kind of go back into the sentence and try to work the sentence out so that it can be seen and heard and felt in one breath, or maybe a couple breaths, but the idea being that the sentence is complete.
Thanks. I like looking at it that way. Thank you. So now you've moved from prose poetry to translations.
Yeah.
So you must be translating poems that are in line breaks, or are they prose poems too?
Well, these particular poems were published in the early part of the 20th century, and they were traditional verse poems with line breaks.
So
and
tell us about what country and authors and how you're...
Well, I started a translation. I could back up a little bit. I started a translation series with Bedouin books a year ago, and published a Georgian poet who's never been published in the English language, has been published in German and been translated before. And the poet and writer Lynn Coffin, who lives in Seattle, has translated his work in a number of journals and other books, and this would be his first full-length English book. So it's out. It's called Still Life with Snow. It's great to hear a good translation, a poetic translation in English of a language that for most of us is, in the case of the Georgian language, even the script and the sound is unrecognizable for most of us English speakers. So it's interesting to hear that transition into English, and still that Eastern European flavor, or in this case, Central Asian flavor of the writing. So I've always been interested in translation, and this series that I'm starting with Bedouin Books has led me to kind of investigate some translating of my own. And I've always been fascinated by the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, the French poet, the father of surrealism, as he's kind of known for coining that phrase. And he wrote a rather traditional book of poems in the early part of the 20th century called Alcohols. And I don't speak French, but I do speak Italian, and I can transliterate French from the Latin language. And so I've started to translate those poems. I'm only a small portion of the way into this project, but the process is proving to be really, really enjoyable.
So you are using your knowledge of Italian to read French and your knowledge of poetry to find the English translation.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lengthy process. It must take a while.
Yeah, it does. This book, by the way, Alcohols, has been translated many times in English and has been confounding translators for many years. But there's a rhyme scheme in the French, and many of the English translators abandon it. And that's one of the focuses that I put into this work, is how to bring that back in. It might end up being rather than a straight translation, it might actually be an interpretive translation in the end, but we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. And you're saying it is called Alcohols? Mm-hmm. And what does that mean?
Well, I think it's the title from the book is sort of about the author's idea of elixirs. He coined the word surrealism, and this is before really the surrealists. This book was published before the surrealists really kind of took off. They were in a group that was developing during this time. So the poems are almost proto-surrealist, and I'm really looking into making that part be evident in the poems. The English translations that I've seen today don't have that imagination really put into it. So I think the Alcohols title is really about the imagination of kind of the ether, mm-hmm. That comes from the writing.
And as you talk about it, I can't help think about your background, well, your current job, being executive director of a Northwind Arts Center, which is a visual arts gallery, and your background in architecture, and you're roaming the desert and listening to stories. And it seems to me that in some way, surrealism, or a poet who's made the prototype for that and named it, seems somehow in keeping with the merging of all these backgrounds. I'm not sure I have language for it. Maybe you do. Does it seem to you that this all sort of comes together in some way, that another person might not take this on in the way you did because they don't have your background?
Well, that's an interesting point. I never thought of it that way. One of the main things that I noticed was lacking in the translations of this particular poet was the humor and the imagination that wasn't being translated into English. And
you saw a structure of rhyme that other people either didn't or abandoned.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, I think it does. I think it does
I
come
think it
together.
does, too.
Yeah, there's a lot of
So-
ways to pull this together.
I don't know if this is putting you on the spot, but before we end, I wonder if you just have an image from one of those poems that you've been working on, just one image that maybe speaks to this combination where sensing exists.
So one of the poems was I started this project by choosing a very simple poem, which was one line, and it had a very stark and humorous image in it, and almost an image that doesn't even translate to our modern era. And I don't want to butcher the French by reading it in French, but the original translator of the work, William Meredith, translated it, "And the single string of the trumpet's marine," and the poem is called Singer. And so I translated it into a different way, which is more, I think it speaks to the time, and it's, I call it Cantor, and an ocean liner of marine trumpets. And I thought the image there was more magical and spoke to the time, and you think of an ocean liner with marine trumpets. I mean, it's just a completely surrealist image.
And it's more an object. The first translation was, the image was, can you repeat the image?
Yeah, the first translation, "and the single string of the trumpet's marine."
So yours has an object in it, just like an architect would imagine,
Yeah.
right? Something fabulous. I do think it all goes together. And I think when we follow our noses into our projects, and you certainly have, and you've described to us how you have, wonderful things happen. So we only have a very limited amount of time, and I did want people to know your blog so they could read more of what you were doing, what you're posting lately. So would you like to tell us your blog URL?
Sure. It's called Unabridged, and the idea there is that I have it up on the internet as a chalkboard, so I'm not editing this. It's an unedited version, and you can read a little bit about my reasonings for that. But it's mandrosandro.wordpress.com, and that's mandrosandro.wordpress.com.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. And I know I'm a little late welcoming you to Port Townsend after a year, but welcome to Port Townsend. I'm so glad you're here.
Well, thank you, Sheila. Thank you for inviting me.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Production coordinator is Mike Schlexer.